Greetings, travelers. I'm Kaiserkrat, and this is my kingdom. Why is this happening? The context of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is incredibly complex and has a history that goes back decades. In this way, understanding the Ukrainian situation often revolves around Russia's relationship with the USA. At the beginning of the 1980s, Ukraine and Russia were both part of the same nation, the Soviet Union. The Cold War, which had been simmering through a period of détente between the two superpowers, began to heat up again. Ronald Reagan gave his famous Evil Empire speech. The threat of nuclear war hadn't been closer since the 1960s. However, with the ascension of a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, Reagan and Gorbachev began to understand each other and their respective nations to a greater degree. Thus, by the late 1980s, the Cold War, which had such defined the second half of the 20th century, began to be dismantled. At the same time, the communist system also began to be dismantled. The communist bloc had been stagnating economically for years, and with an increasing underground influence by Western media, faith in society in the communist nations of the Soviet bloc began to fail. Gorbachev's reforms failed. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Over the next 2 years, communist regimes in the Soviet bloc fell one by one. The Soviet Union itself ended up collapsing in 1991. However, before that, one of the main issues was German reunification. The two main military alliances between the two superpowers, NATO in the west and the Warsaw Pact in the east, centered on the potential battlefield in the heart of Germany. However, with the failure of the East German government, there were talks of reunifying Germany for the first time since World War II. East Germany would be absorbed into West Germany, and the whole of the country would maintain its NATO membership. This was a deal made between U.S. President George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, as Germany would reunify, but NATO would not move 1 inch eastwards, a promise that was kept for a time. This deal alleviated Soviet concerns, but the situation would quickly change. First of all, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, breaking apart into 15 different successor nations, including an independent Russia and Ukraine. Second, the USA elected a new president, Bill Clinton. In this post-Cold War era, the United States was the dominant power on the world stage. A world of two superpowers was now down to one, and the whole world seemed to lay at America's feet. One of the questions America faced was, what next? A strategy Clinton and his administration developed was to extend protection and security to the whole litany of post-Soviet states, wary of being under the Russian boot. Questions were raised. What was the purpose of NATO now that the Soviet Union was gone? NATO membership was even considered for the Russian Federation, although ideas of Russia actually joining were half-hearted on both sides. The Cold War divide still dug deep. Ultimately, it was decided under Clinton to bring more nations under the American umbrella. Russian President Boris Yeltsin warned this was a dangerous plan, as it would antagonize Russia long-term, even as Russia could do nothing about it in the 90s. At this time, Russia was suffering from the economic, political, and social collapse of communism and suffered a terrible depression. Average life expectancy fell by nearly a decade when compared to late Soviet years. Russia was weak and unable to resist their former enemies on a geopolitical basis, and yet former Eastern Bloc nations flocked to the idea of joining NATO, as it was in principle a volunteer-based organization. The first round of NATO expansion occurred in 1999 with the addition of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. These were formerly important members of the Warsaw Pact, now having thrown off their communist regimes and eager to integrate with the West. It is no surprise that not long afterwards, after Yeltsin's 2 terms as president, a younger, more ambitious man managed to take power in Moscow. His name was Vladimir Putin, and he dreamed of making Russia stand tall again, becoming an important player on the world stage and regaining lost Soviet glory. A staunch Russian nationalist, he believed NATO expansion eastwards, in violation of the agreement made between Bush and Gorbachev, was a threat to Russia. Ostensibly, critics of the agreement would say that it was made between the USA and the Soviet Union, not Russia, which no longer exists. Also, they say it was never a formal agreement, but a verbal understanding. Sorry, should have got it in writing. Better luck next time. Unfortunately, geopolitics do not work in this childish gotcha fashion. Even though NATO is ostensibly a defensive alliance, pledged to protect all members through Article 5 protection, in which an attack on one member nation is to be treated as an attack on all nations, it is also a military alliance. From Russia's point of view, NATO expansion eastwards, which continued into the 2000s and 2010s and into the 2020s, is moving closer and closer to its borders. As of 2004, NATO enlargement does touch Russia's borders with the addition of Estonia and Lithuania. The main issue today is the potential addition of Ukraine into NATO, which has been a possibility since the late 2000s. Russia sees Ukraine as a sister nation, born out of the same Slavic civilization in the form of the Kievan Rus over 1,000 years ago. Russia and Ukraine have a deep history going back centuries, well before Soviet times and the terrible atrocities of Stalin and the Soviet regime. However, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had been split, unsure whether to choose to move closer back to Russia or closer to the West. The other Eastern Bloc nations have chosen the West and ultimately benefited from it in terms of standard of living and development. This crisis and war that Russia and Ukraine find themselves involved in is multifaceted, with points such as it being a construct of Putin, an old man wanting to relive the old Soviet glory days. In Putin's day, Russia controlled territory up to Germany. Now that is all aligned against him. Ultimately, this is a question of what is the place of Russia in the modern world. How extensive Putin's ambitions are to rebuild the Soviet Empire are unclear, but they also intersect with real security concerns the Russian military has when a hostile, anti-Russian alliance expands ever closer to its heartland. Famed and detested, but also undeniably intelligent, foreign policy maker Henry Kissinger said that Russia's natural western frontier includes eastern Ukraine and Belarus, but pushing into western Ukraine up to the borders of Poland is too far. Quite wise words, and perhaps we're seeing a natural realignment towards that state of being, as Russia has always traditionally dominated Eastern Europe. What is the balance of power between these nations, who have suffered under Russian rule, and Russia, who feels threatened by Western expansion up to their borders? It could get quite murky very quickly, and innocents have already been caught in the crossfire. I'm not sure. Russia could re-emerge as a major power in Eastern Europe, or they could crumble under the pressure of global sanctions against them. A weakened Russia could easily fall under the sway of a rising China, a long-term process that seems to be accelerating. Putin could be overthrown, or die soon, or take out the world in a global nuclear crescendo. Russia could become a true democracy in the next few years, throwing off the old Soviet shackles that still linger like a haunting ghost, finally joining the Western system. Or there could be a post-Putin power struggle, seeing the largest nation on Earth descend into a horrifying civil war, with nuclear weapons tossed up in the gambit. Time will tell. All we know is history is being made. Sometimes it takes a bit of a wake-up call to truly remember we are living in it. Thank you for listening, and until we meet again, safe travels.